Phil here, and this week, I've been working like crazy to get an Emperor's Children warband finished up for a conversion video. While I've managed to get all the models built, the editing's taking me way longer than expected. So this week, I'm going to share some of the tips that I used to get all of my small details on these models right, and then next week my plan is to release the entire video on how I converted each of these 6 models. One thing I really tried to do with this warband was get pretty creative with adding the small details to the models such as studs or these super finicky Emperor's Children icons from the Fulgrim kit. I find that these details are key in elevating the quality of the final conversion and help to sell the illusion that my models are off-the-shelf kits as opposed to something I bashed together. Because they're so small though, they're extremely tricky to work with, and in this video I want to share some of the tips and tricks I've picked up over the years to make cutting, manipulating, and gluing these parts as easy as possible. When it comes to cutting, it's extremely important that you use a fresh, sharp knife blade. A lot of the time I will either need to cut off bits of some resin backing, such as with these 3rd Legion icons, or cut my bit off of a larger part such as these bonding studs from the Space Marine Mark 6 shoulder pad. In both of these cases, having a sharp blade will allow you to more easily control your cuts with less force, meaning that there's a lot less of a risk of you accidentally breaking your piece, or your knife slipping and cutting something you didn't want it to, whether that's another part of your model or your fingers. For the banner I'm doing here, I changed my knife blade out 3 or 4 times to ensure that it's always sharp as possible. Luckily, these blades are pretty cheap, and I think I got this pack of 120 of them on Amazon for like $9. The other tip with cutting that I find very useful is to apply a gentle sawing motion with the blade, as opposed to trying to slice clean through. Because there's less pressure applied behind my knife blade, this reduces the risk of the part I'm trying to cut flying off across my room, get eaten by my carpet, and never to be seen again. Now that the bit's been cut out, the real fun starts, as I need to make sure I, 1, don't lose it, and 2, can manipulate it in order to get into the position I want it to be on the model. I definitely don't have the most dexterous fingers, and I find manipulating these pieces really freaking hard actually. The problem is further compounded when trying to attach the parts together, as I've always found that superglue is far more likely to bond the bit to my skin than to what I actually want to attach it to. I've tried using tweezers for this in the past, but I've always found them far more frustrating than helpful, especially when dealing with irregularly shaped or round objects. So instead, I have started using my hobby knife tip to stab my bit and pick it up. This works pretty well, as it allows me to manipulate the bit far more easily using my craft knife blade. And since the part is stuck on with friction alone, I should be able to get it off of my knife when I go to glue it on to where it actually belongs. There are a couple of things to call out here though, with the first being that you need to make sure that your knife has a very sharp tip for this to work. It's probably pretty obvious, but this doesn't work if your knife is either dull or is missing its tip completely. The other thing that I have found critical is that you need to put your part on something hard so you can actually push your blade into it. If you just use the tip of your finger, you'll end up pushing your bit into your fingertip and not actually have it catch on the blade. Your desktop will work pretty well for this, but I've started to use my thumbnail, which I prefer as I have a nasty habit of losing my tiny parts in the various plastic shavings and other detritus that inevitably collects on my desk. When doing this, you only want to apply enough pressure to your knife so that it catches your bit on the tip of it and doesn't slice clean through and break the part you're trying to work with. No matter what you're gluing together, I'd highly recommend that you use a brush applicator for your glue, as opposed to something from a dropper bottle. The parts are so small here that excess glue drops will either cause texture issues on the model, or eventually gum up and obscure details on the parts we're working with. I personally use Tamiya thin plastic cement for gluing plastic parts, and Crazy Superglue with a brush applicator when working with resin. But any brand you can find locally should work just fine. I change up my gluing approach though, depending on if I'm using superglue or plastic cement. When using superglue, I make sure to apply the glue to the larger model first before sticking on my tiny part, whereas with plastic glue, I apply the glue to the tiny part first and then stick it onto the model. This is because I've had trouble in the past when using superglue, where my part would stick onto the applicator brush, and I ended up getting superglue everywhere when I tried to get it off. This isn't really an issue to worry about though with plastic glue. With all these tips in mind, and a little bit of patience and a steady hand, of course, you should find working with these tiny bits a little bit easier. Oh, God, I'm using bits way too much in this video, but I don't know how else to say them. Tiny parts, tiny... and bits, whatever. Anyways, I hope you found this helpful and will give you some encouragement to try to carve up your own models and get extra details onto your conversions to really push them over the edge from a nice conversion that looks pretty good on the tabletop to an excellent one that'll leave people wondering if it's an actual model from Games Workshop or something you converted yourself. I'm always happy to hear from my viewers, and in this case, if there's any tips or tricks that you know of to work with these smaller parts that I didn't cover in this video, please let me know so I can make sure to cover them later on. As always, thanks for watching, and hobby on.